Hello, I will be covering the reading The Elephant No One Sees, Natural Recovery Among Middle Class Addicts. This is from the online readings. This is from the previous edition of the textbook. The readings scanned in and can be found under additional required readings under section or segment 4. This is by Robert Granfield, William Cloud in 1996. So this is an older article, but interestingly enough, there's still a lot of interest in this topic. But we see, that it's maybe not, doesn't garnish as much media attention. I just want to address before I get into this topic, this is really looking at natural recovery versus more formal recovery and rehabilitation facilities. This is obviously a sensitive topic. A lot of us probably know someone who has used the 12-step program to achieve sobriety and really better their life. I just want to address, I'm not talking down about the 12-step program or bashing the 12-step program in any way, but ultimately, I've talked about this a lot in our class, but there's this one-size-fits-all model in our country. If you have an issue with addiction, substances, what is the responsible thing to do? And it's to go to a rehabilitation facility, oftentimes very expensive, and requires a lot of time, usually at least 30 days, in the facility here. So once again, this is just addressing an alternative to the rehabilitation, formal treatment centers, and looking into this kind of hidden population that has gotten clean on its own, and so be talking about that. But just want to address, I'm not, talking bad or, saying we should get rid of the 12-step program. Just ultimately, there's alternatives that might suit other people better, or, perhaps the ideas of the 12-step model don't really agree with certain people's attitudes, perceptions of themselves, and how they, might get clean on their own. So let me pause this real quick. All right, so on slide number 2, there's a link for a short video on the disease model, and this is really kind of explaining the general idea of the disease model. We've talked about this a lot in class. I'm not going to go into this too much. And the video kind of covers it, but this is the idea of there's definitely a lot of scientific evidence supporting the disease model, specifically looking in the brain. With that being said, kind of addresses this idea of labeling it a disease, and in some ways kind of makes it easier to try to deal with a very complex issue, and how this disease model might benefit the medical community. Just a short video, about 1 minute and 45 seconds, but something we've really talked about in this society too. Are we really treating addiction as a disease, or do we like to call it a disease because we don't, it's not necessarily treated like any other disease. No one is blamed for having asthma, diabetes. But all right, moving on to the next slide. Background. This is just from the reading, just kind of goes into a little bit of information regarding the 12 steps group. I'll be talking about a few of the steps. If you're not familiar, please review this section. But all right, so moving on to the next slide, slide number 4, introduction. We see that social deviance here, this literature usually talks, this is what we've talked about a lot throughout the semester, is these addicts, specifically alcohol, having addiction to alcohol, but drugs also is kind of this other in society here. And, when we've looked at a lot of the research, it really focuses on these addict groups that fit these stereotypes of addiction, the people who come into contact with law enforcement, people who are treatment facilities, or perhaps hospitals. These are who most commonly get researched, not the people that are these hidden populations that perhaps, get clean and sober on their own without the use of, treatment facilities, or never went to a hospital, never have been arrested here. But what we say, a lot of research says these portrayals of the way, focusing on these stereotypes really contributes to kind of the ghettoization of drug users, and just reinforces these stereotypes. Think about, when we've talked about the stereotypes connected to, the addiction of crack, and, what comes to mind, this image of usually, inner city ghetto situation here. So, you know, this is really just kind of talking about how these portrayals, you know, contribute to our stereotypes that we have regarding drug use and addiction here. Sorry. Okay, sorry, continuing on here. But yeah, you know, we see a lot of research on social deviance has expanded our knowledge about a lot of different topics that are really stereotyped, you know, whether this be, you know, heroin addicts, you know, these crackheads, some of these different things where we've dispelled some of the stereotypes and myths that we've talked about in the class, and we'll continue to address for the remainder of the semester. But ultimately, we see that research really has failed to look into these groups that don't fit into these stereotyped addicts. You know, and this research is specifically looking at middle-class addicts who quit their addiction without the use of treatment and are another group not found in the research. So this is really looking at this hidden population here. All right, moving on to slide number 5. This is just a short little video from the same doctor. He's a specialist in the field of addiction and recovery, but really just talking about this idea of, you know, an alternative to the disease model, you know, and kind of talking about it might be up to 50% quit, you know, their addiction on their own, but just talking about this alternative to the disease model. And, you know, I'll talk about this more, but, you know, for certain people who are, you know, really, really, really addicted, don't have a lot of things going on for their life in the slump, you know, they're not going to, might not be able to get, you know, sober on their own. But for certain segments of the population, you know, they may be able to get clean and sober on their own. And what more and more research is showing is that there's a large amount of people out there who have, you know, quit their addictions on their own. And we'll be getting into kind of looking into what these populations, what this kind of alternative disease model, what populations this might work better for as opposed to other populations where we see the rehabilitation facilities, 12-step programs might be more appropriate for them. So, all right, moving on to this idea of natural recovery here. This is really about, you know, getting clean, quitting the excessive use of addictive substances without formal treatment here. And, you know, this really goes against the dominant addiction paradigm here, you know, that views addicts that have an illness, they require therapy. If you're sick, you're supposed, and you have an illness, you're supposed to go see a doctor, you're supposed to go see specialists, you know. And so we see this still takes a, you know, this is still the dominant ideology in our society now. You know, it's just that the individual possesses an illness that requires intensive therapeutic treatment here. But ultimately, natural recovery is not a new idea. I mean, as early as people have been addicted to anything, natural recovery has also been, you know, an element. Not everybody who's ever got clean in history used some type of established program, 12-step, you know, rehabilitation. So obviously natural recovery is something that has taken place, you know, but we look at, when looking at research on natural recovery, it really looks at how addicts successfully change their lives without therapy or self-help groups here. This, you know, at the bottom it says social context can change an addict's behavior, more of a cognitive approach here. But, you know, social context is a big factor that we'll be looking into, you know, for people who might, natural recovery might be more appropriate as opposed to other populations in terms of addiction here. So give me 1 second. I'm going to pause this. All right, so moving on to slide number 7, intro continued. This is just, and this is looking into a study from 1986 from Bernanke. And this was a former heroin addict, but study on heroin addicts. This is one of the most detailed investigations into natural recovery here, and really emphasized, you know, the social context of addicts here. You know, what do they have going on in their life? You know, somebody who perhaps lives in an area with a lot of drug use, poor neighborhood, not a lot of opportunity, doesn't have a lot of, you know, doesn't have children, doesn't have a wife, doesn't have a good job, doesn't have a lot of things to lose, and is surrounded by an environment where drugs are used in an unhealthy manner, versus somebody who's upper middle class, has a good job, they don't want to lose, has children, has, you know, a career, have people looking out for them. I'll go into this a little bit more here, but, you know, really looking at these, the strategies that have been used for, quitting their addiction here, and without this formal treatment. One of them, ending relationships with other drug users. The people that I've known who've gotten clean, the majority of them, that's what they had to do. They said, I had to remove myself from hanging out with the people that I know that use. And that was, what really proved successful for them. Obviously, there's varying degrees of addiction here, but it's about taking themselves out of the drug using environment here, creating these new structures in their life, and use of friends and family as a social network of support. So that's a big thing at the end here, use of friends and family as social network of support. Not everybody has friends and family that are willing or there as a social network of support. So, that's something to factor in. But these are just, a few findings from this major research, 1986. Hold on, I need to check that out. I think that's a mistypo. All right, sorry, my computer's having trouble loading up the reading. I'll get back to that on you. But yeah, so ultimately just looking at these different ways, that people were able to quit drugs here. Want to just address, though, social context plays a role in this study, but it's unclear if the social context was completely different for those who quit naturally versus formal treatment in this study. This wasn't the major focus here, but, looking in this research, it was, there were environmental factors that significantly influenced the strategies employed and the decisions to stop. So, just want to emphasize that, social context was slightly addressed in this, but it's not unclear this wasn't focusing on the social context of these drug users, but definitely it was very clear that environmental factors had a major influence here. All right, moving on to slide number 8 here. Intro continued. Ultimately, this research on, looking at these addictive behaviors is going to benefit from examining these people who quit their addiction without the use of formal and informal treatment methods. Need more research on this topic here. And this current study looks at middle-class addicts who use natural recovery to overcome their addiction. Really focuses, a lot of this is on the identities of the addict. We've talked a little bit about this, but having this identity addict and what that means, really looks at why these people don't want to use self-help groups or formal treatment, and, find these different strategies that they use to overcome addiction, understanding this hidden population and how they're able to get clean, why they chose to get clean on their own, or get sober without, using these more formal techniques. The methods here. This is a 2-stage design here, detailed interviews, 46 participants total, 25 in the first stage, 21 in the second stage. The first stage examined 3 areas here, elements of successful quitting strategies, perception of self relative to use, and attitudes towards treatment. This was 25 interviews. The second stage built on the first stage by focusing on prominent themes found in the first stage. So those were the rest of the interviews. Moving on to slide 10 here. Methods. Give me 1 second. All right, sorry, I got to pause here again. All right, looking at this. So methods, criteria for participants here. They must have been a drug or alcohol dependent for at least 1 year. The average, though, people had been dependent for 9.14 years. And then they had to quit their addictive behaviors for at least 1 year prior to the interview. On average, people have been quit their addictive behaviors for 5.5 years. And they had to have quit using no or minimal formal treatment. So if you used a short-term detox, less than 2 weeks, you were still, able to participate in the study. And you had to have less than 1 month exposure to self-help groups. So some of these people, it's not that they never went to self-help groups, but, these people who went to self-help groups and found them not useful for themselves. This was selected using snowball sampling. This needed to be snowball sampling because a lot of these people, the majority of them, wanted to really hide their past identity, or their past addiction, I should say. So it was really kind of finding this hidden population. Once again, if you remember on our steroids reading, these hidden populations usually requires snowball sampling. Talk to people, they suggest other people, and then it kind of builds like a snowball. So next slide here, methods, slide 11. All participants were from middle-class background, all completed high school. The majority had college degrees. Several had graduate degrees here. Most participants had professional occupations, law, engineering, managerial positions, business owners, but ultimately they do not fit into the stereotype idea of an addict here. And that's, a major focus on this reading, and really want to highlight, as we're talking about this, that, think about, these kind of the background. They have middle class, good jobs, degrees. So, this is something really emphasized, and, for people who might find natural recovery to be successful for them. Moving on to the next slide, 12, the demographics, 30 males, 16 females, age range 25 to 60, with the mean age being 38 to 0.4 years old. So, all right, moving on to the next slide, forming a post-addict identity, slide number 13. All right, so looking at this forming post-identity, we've talked about this previously in the semester, but this symbolic interactionist perspective, really focusing on, the self and how this emerges from interactions with others, our social interactions, and through the roles they have, this really defines our social reality, this perception of, how we perceive ourselves through interacting with other people. We learn, about ourselves. We can also change ourselves, but ultimately it's about, the self is not rigid. It's this ongoing process and changing, with new definitions of the self emerge as, group affiliation and roles change, so the people you affiliate with and also the roles that you play in your life can really define your social reality and define your perspective as whether, you are an addict or, you're a father, you are a lawyer, whatever it may be. Some of these master statuses that we've talked about throughout the semester here. Oh, sorry, I was making sure that was recording. But we see self-help groups give members the sick role, labeling addicts as sick here, These programs have the view that addiction is incurable. You will always be an addict. I've talked about this in class, people who've been clean for 25 years. And I know personally somebody who has, Lou Gehrig's disease, is dealing with some medical issues, but will still not try cannabis because, the idea that, you are always an addict, and this is a disease. So, I'm not arguing against that per se, but, for some people, this viewpoint, doesn't really resonate well with them here, but ultimately this addiction is incurable, and, it really gives the person master status as an addict. I am an addict. I will be for the rest of my life, and I'm just trying to deal with that day by day here. Like these 12-step programs, AA really teach members they possess this disease, and if it's an addiction to alcohol, it's a lifelong addiction to alcohol, and the propensity for addiction to other things. You must undergo a personal transformation, adopt a new role, but and you're still always going to have to adopt this role as the identity of an addict, and to deal with this. So it's ultimately, for these more formal AA 12-step groups here, this is, I'm an addict for the rest of my life, even if I never touch another drug or another drop of alcohol here. So, it's really focusing on what does this mean to have the identity of an addict, something we've talked about a lot and throughout the semester. Moving on to the next slide here, forming a post-addict identity. All right, so moving on to slide 14 here, forming a post-addict identity here. So really looking at, how these participants viewed themselves, why perhaps for them they didn't feel like this, master status identity as an addict was important for them as the way it is kind of, taught in the 12-step programs, AA. But yeah, so we see that, in this study, they did not view themselves as addicts nor ex-addicts. This had nothing to do with their identity. This was 2/3 of the respondents here. Most reported they saw themselves in some other way here. they did not see their past addiction as a central role in their identity. So, this is kind of the opposite of what we see in the 12-step programs here. There was several cases where they really, people, respondents reacted strongly against addiction as a disease ideology, believed, that this was a permanent identity and it would impede their continued social development here to have this permanent identity as an addict. They did not adopt the addict identity as a master status for, the people in this research here. Looking at, addicts who extensively participate in self-help groups often engage in long-term self-labeling process as an addicts. And for them, that was something they didn't seem beneficial for them. And, looking into some of the research that raised concern over kind of these deleterious nature of self-labeling and, the sick role in relation to ending addictive behaviors here. So, this is just kind of from these respondents here, but, this idea of, this self-labeling process at an addict, did not agree with the ideas and the views of, the people who were able to get clean through this natural recovery. The participants were very selective with whom they discussed their past addiction with. This was not important to their identity, obviously, to not wanting to, socialize or, be around other drug users. But it was really about transcending their addict identity and adopting self-concepts congruent with their contemporary roles. I'm way more than an addict. I never saw myself as an addict, perhaps, but it's my contemporary roles are, I'm really, what's most important. So this is where I would ask you why this might be beneficial for certain people here. But ultimately, the fact is, these people didn't adopt addict identities. And this is a very important contradiction to the assumption of most of our treatment programs, and specifically, the more commonly known ones, 12-step, AA, and a lot of different rehabilitation facilities here. But it's this, you're in an indefinite state of recovery here. All right, so moving on to circumventing the treatment, slide 15 here. I really want to look at why these respondents decided not to get formal treatment. Treatment was beneficial for some, but saw it as inappropriate for themselves. So even saying, hey, it's not that I'm against it, but for me, this was not appropriate, and I did not feel like this was the best way for me to deal with my addiction or my problem, however they viewed it. Several common reasons for rejecting treatment: oppose the idea that they were powerless to their addiction. This is one of, the ideas behind the 12-step program. You are powerless to your addiction. You will always be an addict here. But for a lot of these people in this program, they saw this powerless to an addiction as counterproductive. And some almost saw it as demeaning, saying, I saw themselves as strong-willed. Look at what I've accomplished. I'm a lawyer. I got through law school, raising kids. But, it was just this idea that I'm powerless to my addiction is almost, demeaning, counterproductive. They viewed it. And, for a lot of them, almost insulting, who viewed themselves as really being strong-willed. Obviously, a person who views themselves as strong-willed is probably going to be a little bit more appropriate for, this natural recovery versus somebody who doesn't have as strong of a willpower here. One of the things they said is they disliked the culture associated with self-help programs here. They felt the programs were dangerous because they were spending so much time with other addicts. They wanted to cut all ties with any addicts completely once and completely just ending their drug use, which I think is understandable. We looked in the earlier Bernanke study, but for a lot of people who quit using, they have to remove themselves from people who are using them and, remove themselves from that situation. Obviously, on one hand, there's a major benefit to being exposed to, and, being around people who are dealing with the same struggles you are. But, there could be an argument for saying, hey, I don't want to be around people who might use drugs. And, when you look in these 12-step programs, these different things, you have sponsors, responsibility, but ultimately people relapse. And, when you're around other people who, have the same issue, there might be a way to, relapse with somebody else. And for them, they just felt it wasn't good to be around other people that were, you know, dealing with addiction here. One of the things they said was they saw such programs as cliquish and unhealthy. So for some of them, that, you know, one person said all they do is stand around smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee while they talk about their addiction. I never felt comfortable with these people. And this discomfort was felt most by women because they saw the groups as male oriented that didn't include women's needs. There's much more facilities and programs and self-help groups specifically towards women. This is 1996, but ultimately, you know, a lot of women didn't feel, you know, in this research didn't feel, you know, comfortable in these meetings and felt that it was more male dominated here. And, you know, so other common reasons they felt they could end their addiction without formal treatment. Treatment might be too expensive or unavailable for maybe where they're at or for their job, whatever it may be. And another thing here is the programs went against their own beliefs about their recovery process. You know, a lot of these people are strong-willed, successful people who, you know, have a lot of confidence in themselves. And, you know, the idea of, you know, being powerless to the addiction and, you know, they believed, you know, like, hey, I have different beliefs about the way I can quit my addiction, and, you know, it doesn't agree with kind of the teachings of 12-step AA programs, different things here. So moving on to the next slide, the elements of cessation. All right, so looking at these elements of cessation, slide 16, you know, really looking in the research that's shown that people who have a stake in conventional life are better able to change their drug habits versus a sense of hopelessness. We've kind of talked about this throughout the semester, but oftentimes we blame drug users, but oftentimes, you know, there's a lot of social conditions, things that take place in their own life. You could think of all these things that follow under socioeconomic status here, you know, that make it, that makes that more likely that they're able to change their drug habits, which is understandable. We'll talk about this a little bit more here. But this social context of the respondents in the study really helped them to avoid total involvement with the addict subculture here. You know, this idea of cultural protection through education, through structural support, jobs, family, stable homes, you know, economic security. All of these things kind of help them avoid total involvement with the addict subculture and kept them, you know, outside of that subculture where, you know, once again, we're thinking of stereotypes, but poor inner city where, you know, hanging out on the streets, maybe you live in a 1-bedroom small apartment, you don't even have a balcony or anywhere to hang out. So you hang out on the street in front of your place, whatever it may be, all these things that we can kind of been talking about throughout the semester. But, you know, this idea of cultural protection, respondents had people in their lives to whom they could turn to for support also and relied on them. But, you know, they had family and friends, and research states that people with greater resources in their lives are better equipped to overcome drug problems here. With that being said, that doesn't guarantee it. I think, you know, there's countless examples of people who have money, family, jobs, and, you know, still succumb to addiction. So, you know, just really want to point out again, this is just, you know, a certain segment of the population. But, you know, ultimately, you know, this was about distancing themselves from users and this addict subculture, and this was another major element of cessation. You know, overwhelmingly, you know, they had to sever all ties with using the friends that were using, and, you know, this was the most important strategy in successfully terminating their addiction. So, you know, a lot of different things, but, you know, I think, you know, we look at a lot of these different things and, you know, just really want to address once again, you know, this might not be available. This is not saying that, you know, this natural recovery is something that's appropriate for all segments of the population. But when we look at this research and think of how many people get sober on their own, you know, if we were in class, this is usually when I have people, you know, do they know of anybody who's got clean on their own? You know, I know a lot of people that did get clean without formal help. I know a lot of people who got clean with formal help, still attending, you know, AA 12-step meetings, and, you know, it saved their lives, you know. So it's a complex issue. I've been talking about this throughout the semester. Ultimately, for me, the thing I kind of talk about here is we need to be more aware of these alternatives to, you know, rehabilitation, because ultimately the one-size-fits-all model is not going to work. We are too complex as individuals, and also, on the issue of, addiction is so complex. The fact that, these one size fits all models is, does not seem appropriate based on a lot of when you look at the research here. All right, moving on to slide 17, implications. All right, so looking at the implications of this study, the study is really focusing on natural recovery and, could help to develop more effective treatments programs. Ultimately, this isn't about dismissing, the other treatment programs, but developing more effective treatment programs and, having a more wide variety available. We've talked about this a bit, but, the formal rehabilitation industry is $1 million, multi-million dollar industry, all kinds of money being made there. As I've talked about, I've worked for a rehabilitation industry, so there's been a lot that's kind of said that, the more kind of dominant viewpoints on addiction, specifically looking at it as a disease, and from rehabilitation standpoint, they really benefit to have natural recovery be dismissed. And as we talk about it in the class throughout the semester, if someone has an addiction problem, what's the first thing they should do? They should get help. You should put them in some type of treatment center. And I'm not saying that's not the case, but once again, this one size fits all model, this is what we've really been taught to believe. And I think when we step back and look at some of this research, you could understand, with all the money that's made in the rehabilitation industry and, all the commercials that we've seen that, really promote this idea, it's kind of understandable where, obviously there's good, they mean well, they want to get people sober, but these are businesses that are also making a lot of money and, serves to benefit to not have a lot of research and knowledge about natural recovery. I will address also, it's a sensitive topic. If you emphasize natural recovery too much, then maybe too many people who really wouldn't benefit from natural recovery would consider natural recovery and be like, oh no, I can do it on my own. Look at the research that says that natural recovery has been effective for these segments of the population here. But, so really about a more effective, wide variety of treatments, and ultimately understanding this complex issue with a much more broad picture, as opposed to focusing on the stereotypes, people who are arrested, people who go to formal treatment centers, and looking into these hidden populations. Excuse me. Denying the existence of this group discounts the version of reality held by those who use natural recovery. And like I said, as you ask around, I'm sure there's a lot of people who know people who've gotten clean on their own. But ultimately, natural recovery allows individuals to take control of their own lives without relying on experts, which for certain people, is a positive. And, like we talked about all these different things in the articles, but one of the big things is strong-willed people who've, achieved so much in their life and, have overcome so much. The idea that I'm helpless to my addiction and I need to give up power is counterintuitive to the way they've lived their life, their entire life. And it just doesn't make sense for them to go about quitting their habit with this idea of powerlessness and ultimately adopting this addict identity. They say this may limit social reintegration, always seeing myself as an addict and, that is my master status. But, it's really important, focusing on the immediate roles may be more beneficial than continually focusing on addictive past here, focusing on your immediate roles. Okay, yeah, maybe I had an issue with drugs or alcohol, but, I'm a lawyer and I am a parent to my children. And these are the identities that I want to focus on and emphasize here. So really looking at these different things here. But, these middle-class addicts may benefit from more short-term, less intrusive interventions versus other segments of the population that, and it might depend on also the substances, how often it's used, addiction's a wide variety. This is, there might be people that use, every day or multiple times a week versus somebody who's, lost their job to their addiction, losing their children and literally, can't break the cycle. So, it's once again a wide range, a complex issue here. But, you know, really brings up this idea of the necessity for individual treatment matching. You know, those with the most to lose, who have lots of resources, most likely to terminate their addiction naturally, you know. So ultimately, understanding the diversity of treatment options, understanding, you know, what would work best for certain users, you know, and really developing that so we have a more overarching view of the situation and our ability and a better ability to offer up more specific treatment options depending on all of these complex issues that each person comes equipped with when they are dealing with these really difficult problems of, you know, trying to quit whatever their addiction may be. All right, so real quick, gotta pause this. All right, moving on. This next slide, 18, I just found out that this link is no longer working. If you're interested in looking up any specific you know, this moderation management, if you just type in copy and paste this and Dr. Jeff and put that in, there's a lot of different views or videos that come up. But, you know, this is really kind of looking at some of these alternative treatment and philosophy of services here. You know, so looking at alternative solutions here. One of the ways here is, you know, this is something you might not hear much about, but this moderation management, this is something that's been emphasized by certain people. You know, it's ultimately about this idea of, in terms of alcohol, you want to keep drinking, but eliminate the problems. So these are alternative programs that might offer clients a choice that rarely gets mentioned in addiction treatment, the choice to learn how to control their drinking. This is just something, you know, another viewpoint out there. I'm not promoting this per se, but I think it's important to be aware of these different things. With that being said, I think we could argue the dangers of this also by telling people, you know, you could control your drinking when, you know, the heart of the issue is that a lot of these people can't control their drinking. So, you know, once again, this is really about this idea of moderation management is more about, you know, a certain population of people who use this moderation management are usually, you know, well educated, made up of, for the most part, problem drinkers. This is a link for this. These terms, you know, depending on definition here, but these are, you know, people have more of a problem rather than those meeting full-blown alcohol dependence here criteria. So the idea is to teach problem drinkers more responsible drinking habits so they don't develop their habits into all-out alcoholism. You know, obviously there's some evidence that this works for certain people, this moderation approach, but this is really about, you know, how to control their alcohol consumption instead of going into full abstinence. Just interesting, you know, alternative. Once again, I'm not promoting this, you know, but this is something that rarely gets spoken of, you know, and you could understand why, but really just wanted to, you know, offer some different viewpoints here. But all right, I have some discussion questions at the end if you want to review over these. Obviously, I'm not going to ask these to the class. But all right, this kind of wraps this up. I'm not going to lie, I enjoy talking about this topic, but it's always interesting to bring in kind of students' examples. This usually has a lot of input from the students, you know, for promoting and, you know, also, you know, talking about people where, you know, these more intensive treatment programs really work, you know. But yeah, so that's the end of that. And ultimately, you know, I just want to once again say, you know, in no way am I, you know, trying to take away from all the help that's been provided by 12-step programs, AA. This is just about, you know, looking into alternative approaches for, you know, people that found that those programs did not work for them for all the reasons we talked about. But all right, thank you very much and have a good one.